English humour, an impromptu appraisal of English language humour, part 22, Improv. Improvised comedy began in Chicago in April 1980. Of course it didn't. People have been improvising comedy since forever. The earliest we know of is a thing called the Atellan farce, which was an art form very popular around ancient Rome, and surely further flung places. In this, the actors are given a persona and have to improvise around a plot. They were always the same. There was Maccus and Buccus and Manducus and Pappus. You get the idea. Maccus was the head clown. Buccus was the stupid one. So the setup for Father Ted was already in place 2.5 millennia ago. And doesn't this sound rather familiar? The idea of a troupe playing certain people, wandering from place to place to improvise as best they could. Indeed, it's very much like the Commedia dell'arte, which, as we saw earlier, was known in England even before it degenerated into a puppet show. But what we're concerned with in this segment is improvised comedy on stage as an art form, and specifically short form comedy sketches. Often given as originators of improvisation games are Viola Spolin, who certainly used games workshops with the Compass Players, which claims to be the country's first professional improvisational acting company. But the thing here is they're not specifically doing comedy. However, it was often comedy that emerged. As Janet Coleman said, they didn't plan to be funny or change the course of comedy, but that's what happened. Again, these games were used with children as forms of self-expression, also with disadvantaged children, sometimes with prisoners. So they're not really exactly what we're looking for. Some suggest that Dudley Riggs was the first real comedy stage improviser. He was brought up in a circus family, started performing at the age of 5, and learned vaudeville-style comedy. Now, he was often sent around to do the comedy act to places where, guess what, people didn't want to hear it. And he got rather bored of trying to shout down the hecklers, so he took an unusual step. He asked the crowd things like, "Who do you hate in this town?" And if the audience shout back, "The mayor," quickly improvise a scene about the mayor. And thus was born instant theatre, because Mr. Riggs didn't like to call it improvisation. He thought that was still exclusively in the jazz domain, which of course at that time improvised music was also beginning to be a thing. Anyway, Mr. Riggs went to New York City, rented out a space where you could see from the street, and group members would practice. Passers-by would look in and want to see what was going on inside. In fact, some of them offered money to just watch the rehearsals. Another sacred name in the world of comedy improv is Del Close. Del was clearly a big influence on a lot of performers, a lot of whom ended up on Saturday Night Live, the holy grail for the American screen addict. Many of them no doubt join in the annual Del Close Memorial Improvised Marathon, which is held in many theatres around New York. Still in New York, in 1963, a legendary club called the Improvisation, or the Improv, opened and left an indelible mark on not just the improviser, but the comedy performer. Because when they went in to change it from being a Vietnamese restaurant to a comedy club, they obviously stripped off all the wallpaper, but not having much of an idea what to do then, just left the bare brick wall. And that's become something of a trope for comedy clubs and comedy performers all around the world. One more big name from Canada from the 70s was Keith Johnston, another man who was very keen on theatrical improvisation. He invented theatre sports, which later formed the basis of Whose Line Is It Anyway? This was the television show that made short-form comedy impro a household name. The original in England was presented by Clive Anderson in a nice, witty, understated way, as Ryan Stiles and Colin Mockery gambled their way through improvisational skits with many a guest. between 1988 and 1999, when the show was finally pulled after 136 episodes. The first 1988 series was on the radio, which seems curious to me. But as usual, the television took from the radio and the radio took from the surrounding zeitgeist. Improv groups were popping up around the country, especially among professional comedians. On October the 17th in 1985, 4 of the Comedy Store comedians tried to give it a go in front of a live audience. The groundbreakers were Kit Hollaback, Dave Cohen, Neil Malarkey and Mike Myers. Paul Merton joined a month after. And even then, they were only given the second half of the show because they thought people just wouldn't pay to see improvisational comedy. Well, this turned out to be true on 2 counts. 1, it probably wasn't worth paying for anyway, by the admission of the performers themselves. And 2, only 20 people saw it. But they persevered. Whose Line Is It Anyway became a success, and people got used to this kind of comedy. So much so that Sundays became improv night. They were touring, selling out, so in 1989 they branched out to Wednesday night as well. And those were sellouts. Today, the Comedy Store Players, led by Paul Merton, is still capable, or was until COVID, of selling out theatres all around the country. And recently, a venue opened in London which only puts on improv comedy. It's now popular in other countries, of course, including the country I live in, Spain, where I've been improving for almost 20 years. I'm speaking in times of COVID, but if they ever open up bars and theatres again, do come and see the Club de Sastre, which is the name of it. And is also wordplay, of course, because I'm English. Sastre is tailor in Spanish. We do short form, we do comedy, others like long form. There is a form called the Herald, where the scenes have to relate to each other and you tell a story over a period of time. There are others who like a competitive element. I'm not among them. And improvising, like veganism, is not an unknown word these days. At least people know what you're talking about. The strange thing about improvising is that we do it every day. Once we get past hello, how are you? Doesn't seem to be much of a problem to us. Yet when you put people in the frame of a stage with a putative audience, even if it's only the other actors in a rehearsal, suddenly people start to behave differently. So you have to train yourself out of it. The 2 principal rules of improv are: do not negate. So for example, if I'm on a beach and I spread out my towel and say, look at this lovely towel I've just bought, and the other actor says, what towel? Well, you've just destroyed well, it was a really nice towel as well. Why did you do that? And rule number 2 is yes, and. Because it's not enough just to say, for example, hello, I'm the doctor. I've come to see your dying mother. Oh, yes. Come in. Well, you could, but then you're leaving the doctor to move the sketch along. You might say, oh, yes, come in. Mind the dog. Mind the tiger. Why not? And there you've got the beginnings of a sketch. Maybe the tiger mauled your poor mother. How many tigers are there in the house? Etc. Well, improvisation certainly had a boom, and there were a flourishing number of styles and games that swept across America and Canada and the British Isles, and I've no doubt Australia, New Zealand, and as I say, even places like Spain, Germany, Holland, where I believe they improv in English, as is the case in some places in India. Paul Merton's improv chums can still tour the land and fill out big theatres. Whose Line Is It Anyway? Still going strong in the United States. And the most important of all is the idea of improvising is now accepted. In fact, Ross Noble, as I've commented earlier, dispensed with a script altogether and invented his show purely from the comments that the audience gave him. Larry David harnessed the idea to his script writing, where you give the characters the broad idea of the plot. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? That was 2,000 years ago. And you improvise the scene, and then you hand the poor editor all that film footage, usually from 2 angles, and they cobble together an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm. They often have to cut in on S's and P's and T's to make it sound like a natural dialogue. It's all in the edit. It really is. So there's different ways of improving as well. I'll leave you with one improvisation that you can listen to. It's called Why Bother and was made for Radio 3. There are 5 10-minute spoof interviews between Chris Morris and Peter Cook's character Sir Arthur Streeb-Greebling. It's an interesting listen. You can feel the two comedians pulling and stretching at some kind of elasticity and just about managing to keep hold of it. And as I say, it's there for all to enjoy.